Okay, everybody. Hope you had a great spring break. Welcome back. Wanted you to make sure that you watch this video before Friday, April 5th, because once we're finished with our short little discussion of Native Americans, we want to talk about discrimination against African Americans and how that's changed. And obviously, slavery is a big piece of that. So we want to talk about slavery. This PowerPoint is going to look at a lot of different aspects of slavery. It's not comprehensive in any way, but once you watch it, and we come in and answer questions about it, we're going to have a discussion and read some primary sources in class from an autobiography of a female slave to get sort of a more personal sense of what slavery would have been like. We want to start with something that actually isn't slavery, but kind of is an important part of America's history that in the colonial period that we don't usually talk too much about. And that was this idea of voluntary servitude. Many white people in Europe couldn't afford the money, couldn't afford the payment to come across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World on their own. And it was very common for middle-class, poor, white Europeans, a lot of Irish people, British people, people in Western Europe, to sign a contract that made themselves a temporary slave. They called themselves indentured servants. And this would say, I promise to be a servant in someone's house for 2 years in exchange for them paying for me to come across the ocean. And then at the end of whatever the contract said, they would become free and then just live in the colonies and go about their own, establishing their own lives. This was surprisingly common in the early part of the colonial period. As many as 75% of the original colonists that came to Virginia came as indentured servants and then worked for a period of time, got their freedom, and then went about being American colonists. This is not the same as slavery. Obviously, people did this voluntarily. There was nothing voluntary about African slavery, and this was temporary, but it is a big piece of our history. It ends early in the colonial period. Before the American Revolution, there really aren't too many indentured servants left. This becomes less and less popular as African slavery becomes more and more popular, but it is an important piece of American history, and it relates a little bit here to the topic of slavery as well. Involuntary servitude, or what we more commonly call slavery, is a lot more common, and I'm sure you've talked about this at some point in previous classes as well. Just to give you a concept of a few of these, some of the terminology that's used here, the Middle Passage is the name of the system that brings slaves across the Atlantic Ocean. And it's a complicated system that we only have time to just get a little glimpse of. But it was very normal for slavers, and that would be your job, to sail a boat to the west coast of Africa, put it off the coast. You would go in and either kidnap people at random and put them on the slave ship, or trade with different African tribes for people that were captured in wars that went on within Africa. And it was common for people from really Central or Eastern Africa to be brought to the West Coast to be traded into slavery. There really is a whole financial trading system that goes on. The Middle Passage is what the trip across the ocean would have been like. And it would have been brutal, as you can kind of get a sense from that drawing there on the right. The African slaves were packed in as tightly as possible. Obviously, this is a money-making system. That's why you do slavery. So the goal is to pack as many people into the smallest space and keep them alive and get them to America so that they can be sold for a substantial profit. But the slave piece is just a part of a larger system of trade that's called triangular trade or triangle trade. And the next image shows you a diagram of it, and I want to talk a little bit in some detail about what that system would have looked like. As you can see on this map, slaves would be brought to the New World. So not just the United States, but all the Spanish colonies in Central and South America and the islands in the Caribbean had slavery at some point. So there's slave populations in all of those places as well. Those slaves are used to produce more raw materials, either to mine for things like gold and silver in Central and South America. They're used to grow crops primarily in the United States. They're used to cut down trees, all kinds of things that are the production of raw materials. And the New World did not do much in terms of producing finished goods. Their job was to produce raw materials which would then be shipped back to Europe, primarily Great Britain, France, and Spain at this time, eventually more European countries as well. So they would take tobacco and they would ship it to Europe, where it would be turned into finished products, like cigarettes, for instance. They would take wood and ship it back to Europe, where it would be turned into finished products like furniture. They would take cotton produced in the New World, ship it to Britain, France, and other places, and turn it into cloth. So the process was more slaves came to the Americas. That produced more raw materials, which went to Europe. Those goods were produced in Europe, but eventually, you could only sell so many shoes, so many tables, so many finished goods in Europe. There was only so much of a market. So they continued to produce those goods, and they would ship them to Africa and trade them for more slaves. One of the big trades here was guns, the alcohol that can be produced from growing sugar. And those manufactured goods produced in Europe would be taken to Africa, traded for more slaves to be sent to America to produce more raw materials. And you can see how this process just escalates and escalates and escalates. That as you get more slaves to America, you can make more raw materials, more manufactured goods to trade for more slaves. And this goes on for several hundred years. It's incredibly profitable for the people that run all the shipping. And that's one of the reasons why this process continues for such a long time. Thinking about what happens to each of the three continents because of this process. Obviously, America gets a couple of things out of this. One, they get a much larger population through slaves and non-slave Europeans who move to America to help with this process. They also get a lot of development because lots of land is cleared, farms are built, transportation networks are created. So the triangular trade has massive benefits for the Americas, most of which are positive. Europe gets a lot of benefits too because there are lots of people in Europe put to work in the Industrial Revolution, taking raw materials and turning them into finished goods. Okay. What Africa gets out of this is significantly less. Africa gets finished goods, which aren't permanent. And in exchange for that, they lose an immense amount of population. We estimate as many as 10 million people over the course of the slave trade. Africa gets really the short end of triangular trade, is underdeveloped as a result of it, and this has massive long-term consequences for Africa as a continent, and in many ways, some of the issues that Africa has today with a lack of stability, a lack of development, in some ways can be traced back to slavery and the way that the way it destroys Africa and causes really negative financial consequences for the territory. So just a sense of how triangular trade works. It's likely that I could ask this as an essay question, and you could spend some time explaining how triangular trade worked and what the role in the slave trade was. Slavery by the time of the American Revolution, there are a substantial number of slaves in the United States, but slavery is not really that profitable, to be totally honest. Slaves are growing things like tobacco and indigo, but there were other ways to grow those crops that were probably as efficient as using slavery. And there were lots of people in America predicting that slavery was just going to die out because it was not making a lot of money. Then Eli Whitney develops the cotton gin, which is seen there on the right. If you've ever seen cotton when it grows naturally, obviously it looks sort of like a cotton ball, but it's got lots of seeds that are very sharp and spiny in them. And it was very difficult to get those seeds and those little spiny parts of the cotton plant out in order to get the raw cotton that could be used to make cloth. The cotton gin took that job, which was very difficult and time-consuming, and made it quick and easy. And this makes cotton incredibly valuable. If you've ever had to wear wool clothes in warm temperatures, you know how unpleasant that can be. Cotton is a very useful and very comfortable cloth that we use almost in everything we wear today, but that was not true at the time. And people wanted cotton clothes because of all the advantages that they bring. So there's a huge demand, and people realize they can make a lot of money growing cotton. Slaves become necessary to this process because the cultivation of the cotton plants, it's very difficult work, has to be done by hand, and that makes slavery profitable again and really causes it to take off in the United States after around the year 1800 or so. We want to talk a little bit about slave distribution because we know that slavery happens in the South, But we tend to get this image in our minds that everyone in the South had slaves, which absolutely positively was not the case. In fact, only 16% of white people in the South were able to own any slaves at all. So a substantial minority of the South. Most white people in the South did not own slaves. Owning slaves was a very expensive thing to do. A slave would cost thousands of dollars in the value of our current dollars. So only people of means could afford to own slaves. At the same time, most people who own slaves can only afford to own a couple of slaves. The vast majority of the 16% of people that own slaves own less than 10. So the image we get of hundreds of slaves working on massive 1,000-acre cotton plantations, that did happen, but we're really only talking about maybe 500 families in the whole country that own these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of slaves. Most slave owners only owned a handful of slaves. The slaves would probably be used to work in the house, to take care of children, to maintain a garden, on the family's land. And it was not, most slave owners did not own huge numbers of slaves, which is different than what we think of. But again, it's important to talk about that because slavery is a complex system, and not all slaves have the same experiences. Their experiences differ greatly depending on the circumstances. As I just mentioned, there's a lot of variety in how slaves, what they did. We tend to get the image of slaves picking cotton, which was what a lot of slaves did. Field work was very common. But it was also common for slaves to do domestic work in the home, to do laundry, to cook, to raise children, to be nannies, to drive carriages, all of those things that would be required to make a household go in this time period because of the lack of some of the technologies that we enjoy today. There's a number of slaves who also are very talented in specialized labor. So blacksmiths, carpenters, things that would have been very in demand. And it was normal for those slaves with those skills to sometimes be hired out by the master to other people nearby. So if a slave was a skilled blacksmith, you could only there's only so much need for horseshoes and other metalwork on one plantation. That slave might be rented out to other people nearby in order to provide additional income for the slave master. Sometimes those workers that were highly skilled got to keep part of the money that they made working on other plantations. And sometimes that allowed them to buy their freedom. So again, the jobs that slaves would do vary greatly in the American South. Everything from very unskilled work, picking cotton or picking weeds in the field, to people with very highly skilled work that they might be the only people that knew how to do these jobs in the particular town or county where they lived. Same thing with the treatment of slaves. And I just want to caution you by saying, when I say that some slaves were treated well, in no way am I trying to say that slavery was okay or good. But it is true that the way slaves were treated differed greatly from owner to owner, from plantation to plantation. Some slaves were treated incredibly well, lived in the master's house, ate at the master's table, really were treated more like assistants than anything else. And sometimes the slave and the slave master would work side by side on a project or building a house or working on the field or something like that. And some slaves were never whipped and abused. Now, they still had all their freedoms limited, which is something, that isn't okay in any circumstance, but slavery was not always torture, whipping, and abuse. It oftentimes was, but it wasn't always that. And a big piece of the way slaves were treated, especially the way female slaves were treated, was the use of rape. Many, not all obviously, but many slave owners who were male would mistreat their female slaves. Sometimes they'd father children with female slaves. And this is a big part of Southern life, excuse me for my cold, and the way that people, sort of the lore around slavery and the way that Slave masters would get control over their slaves and use fear and violence to intimidate them. It's an important part of the slave story. It was not every plantation and every female slave, but it was something that happened with some regularity. It shows up a lot in slaves that went on to write and tell their own stories after they were freed. Slaves were had a variety of ways of fighting back. We tend to, one of the things that I know you guys are talking about as you read Night right now is that people that are living in awful circumstances, how do they get the power to keep going on? One of the ways is they do small actions that make them feel like they have some control over their own lives. So slaves would do things like intentionally breaking tools, which seems like small and petty, but to them it would be a huge act, it would be a dangerous thing to do, and it would be a huge act of resistance, because if I break my tools, that might mean that it costs the master money to fix them, and it might slow down my work, which means I get a little bit of a break. Slaves would steal time, which means they would work slower when no one was watching. Slaves would embrace things that are pretty common but would be very important to them because they might not always be prevalent. Slaves would embrace music, and they would bring traditional forms of music from Africa that they knew, combine them with things that they had heard in America, and create new forms of music as a way to entertain themselves both during the day while they were working and then at night when they had free time. Slaves would read, which in many places was illegal, but they would try to learn to read as a way to resist their masters. Slaves would embrace religion, hoping for a better life after they died, instead of the suffering that they were going through on earth. And the biggest form of slave resistance was running away. Slaves would frequently run away. Running away didn't always look like, getting on the Underground Railroad and going north, but it did involve running away for at least a period of time, sometimes permanently trying to get your freedom. Slave rebellions were fairly common as well, and this was a big cause of fear among slave masters. Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1832 is probably the most famous of these slave rebellions. A group of slaves led by Nat Turner got guns, killed their slave masters, went trying to free people on other plantations. In some parts of the South, African slaves outnumbered whites substantially on some of these large plantations. And you could see why the white slave owners mistreating the slaves for all of these years would be afraid that if the slaves got weapons, they would fight back and actually be successful in defeating the whites and winning their freedom. So this was a constant fear, and Nat Turner's Rebellion causes a sort of a crackdown on slaves throughout the South because there's a fear that these sorts of things would happen more frequently. Slavery has long-term effects on the South in addition to the effects that it has on the slaves. Because the South is making so much money with agriculture and plantations, the South becomes significantly less urban than the North. So when you have cities growing like New York and Boston and Philadelphia and Cleveland and Pittsburgh and Detroit and Chicago, in the North, you really don't have many cities of that size in the South, because people stay on farms because it's a profitable thing to do. Same thing with manufacturing. Slaves aren't really used in factories very often in the South. So you get the North building most of the factories, and the South is really much more farmland. Same thing with railroads. North is building lots of railroads to develop the infrastructure and transportation of canals, other things like that. The South just doesn't do that because they're holding on to an older way of life that in the long run really sets them back significantly. When immigrants come to the United States, they choose not to go to the South because as an Irish immigrant or some other immigrant from Europe, I couldn't compete with slavery because it was free. So they would move to northern cities where there was a much larger prospect of a job. This meant that the South grew slower than the North. This means in the House of Representatives, there are more representatives from the North than the South over time, causes increased tensions that lead to the Civil War because it's perceived that the South is just going to not be able to keep up in terms of growth, thus won't be able to have the representation, and eventually the government may just change the rules about slavery and make it illegal. generally this lack of innovation, lack of willingness to change that the South has causes long-term problems. And when the Civil War breaks out, the South loses, at least in part, because it can't compete with the North in terms of the number of soldiers, the number of weapons, the amount of railroads and other infrastructure. So slavery, as much as it helps the South, it also hurts the South, and is one of the reasons why when the Civil War happens, the South loses. I hope that that was at least a little interesting. You probably have some questions. I have a few more things we're going to talk about in person relating to this in class. So I look forward to talking about it with you in class on Friday. Thanks.